My name is Doheon Kim, and I serve as the Executive Administrator, as you all know, of the International Law Enforcement Federation. It is a great pleasure and honor to welcome you all today. Distinguished panelists, colleagues, and guests, we gather at a time when turbulent geopolitics of the Middle East and the Korean Peninsula are affecting millions of lives today. This is a critical moment, one that calls on our collective will, compassion, and ingenuity. Nearly 19.5 million people in Yemen now depend on humanitarian aid. In Gaza, daily hot meal distributions have collapsed from over 1 million meals in April to barely a quarter of that today. In June, they sank to just 185,000 per day. Imagine a mother in Gaza queuing desperately for food amid airstrikes. And now picture a child in a Yemeni camp facing severe malnutrition. These are not distant hypotheticals. They're urgent realities. And they're why we are here today. So before I begin, allow me to briefly outline how today's conference will proceed. For each thematic session, our panelists will begin with an opening statement of approximately 9 minutes, as guided previously. Following these statements, we'll open the floor for questions and discussions, allowing for direct engagement between our panelists and participants. We begin with theme 1, enforcing international humanitarian law in the Middle East. In many Middle Eastern conflicts, both state and non-state actors have been accused of grave violations of IHL. Most of us are aware of the ongoing crisis in Syria, Yemen, Iran, and the occupied Palestinian territories. We have seen attacks on hospitals, schools, humanitarian convoys, clear violations of the Geneva Conventions, yet accountability remains elusive. Some actors shield themselves or their allies from scrutiny. And resolutions at the UN Security Council are vetoed, and non-state militias violate legal norms with impunity. When enforcement is weak, civilians pay the price. Impunity flourishes and violence deepens. Next, we then turn to theme 2, strategies to protect civilians in the Middle East. This discussion will focus on the concrete steps to protect communities caught in conflict. This meeting comes at a time when humanitarian action is desperately needed, when displaced families and vulnerable individuals depend on urgent support. We'll explore how to strengthen essential aid, food, water, shelter, and medicine, while also empowering communities to move toward together. We then proceed to theme 3, humanitarian crisis response coordination. Here we'll examine the machinery of relief. How can UN agencies, NGOs, and local authorities work together to ensure effective, timely, and equitable response in affected countries? Perhaps the answer lies in better coordination, preparedness, and innovation. The goal is seamless humanitarian relief, and we are here to work toward it together. After this, we will take a 15-minute break before continuing with theme 4. After the break, we resume with theme 4, effective conflict resolution and peacebuilding. At ILEF, we believe long-term peace begins at the grassroots. Top-down plans, no matter how well-intended, often falter disconnected from local realities. Peace is not given, it is built. And it is built on resilience, dignity, and inclusion. We will examine how grassroots mechanisms, local leadership, community dialogue, and sustained investment can foster peace where it is needed the most. We then turn to theme 5, the Israel-Iran conflict and the role of the United States. This session will explore the strategic implications and regional ripple effects of the ongoing confrontation. We'll discuss strategies to de-escalate the tit-for-tat escalation and the role of the United States in shaping diplomacy and balance in the region. We'll also examine Iran's nuclear program, the long-term implication it poses, and the complex ideological and proxy dimensions in the conflict. Special attention will be given to how this confrontation affects tensions in the Gulf, disrupts alliances, and contributes to broader regional insecurity. And finally, we conclude with theme 6, preparing for the unthinkable, the humanitarian and human rights imperatives in the event of a DPRK contingency. This session addresses an often overlooked dimension of Korean Peninsula and security, the humanitarian and civilian response in the event of a sudden instability in North Korea. So we'll examine international obligations for refugee protections and discuss anticipatory planning and multilateral coordination. We'll also consider how a civilian-led law enforcement supported response can uphold humanitarian principles while avoiding the securitization of refugee flows. Finally, we will draw on lessons from other regional crises to inform practical and rights-based contingency planning. Ladies and gentlemen, this conference brings together a diverse voice in response to a shared and urgent call: the protection of civilians. From Gaza to Syria, from Yemen to Seoul, we are united by a common responsibility to uphold international law, safeguard human dignity, and promote principled humanitarian action. And that is why we have come together today. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you all once again. And with that, let us now begin what I trust will be a very thoughtful, solutions-oriented, and meaningful dialogue. Thank you. Okay. So now I'd like to invite all of our panelists to introduce themselves, each and every one of you, from Mr. Pellaton to counterclockwise to Mr. Rossi. Please have the floor.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting. My name is Tobias Privitelli. I'm the director of the Geneva International Center for Humanitarian Demining.
Good morning, everyone. This is Sarah Sava, and I'm the Deputy Director, member of the ACT Alliance based in Syria.
Morning, everyone. My name is Annika Hilling Norberg. I'm head of Peace Operations, Peacebuilding at the Geneva Center for Security Policy.
Morning, everyone. My name is Farzan Sabet. I'm a managing researcher at the Sanctions and Sustainable Peace Hub at the Geneva Graduate Institute and a consultant at the Eurasia Group.
Morning, everyone. I'm Anas Saraf from Iraqi Federation Industries. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Jamie Williamson. I'm the Executive Director of ICoCA, the Responsible Security Association. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Caroline Pellaton, the Operations Director at the Geneva Water Hub.
Hi, my name is Oliver Fink. I'm a senior researcher with Swiss Peace.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is
Okay, thank you very much for all the introductions. As you may have heard, these are the most distinguished panelists you can have in year 2025. So we really appreciate you all, and we appreciate all the participants out there. So we now move into our first session, enforcing international humanitarian law in the Middle East. This session, as mentioned earlier, will examine where gaps remain in the enforcement of IHL, what obstacles stand in the way of accountability, and how we can work together to strengthen civilian protection in armed conflicts. So we're honored to welcome our two distinguished panelists for the session, Mr. Williamson, and then Dr. Pellaton. Mr. Williamson, please have the floor when you're ready.
Good morning again, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this event. It is a hot August morning here, so I'm going to speak slowly and every now and then fan myself if required. There's also a little bit of pressure, I think, on the first two panelists, I dare say, in terms of trying to set the tone and maybe some framework issues, but also some provocative questions on a few bits and pieces. I gather we have between 5 and 9 minutes to lay some foundations to then allow for more interactive set of back and forth and Q&A as required on some issues which I think are going to be unpacked throughout the morning. Just before I go into the kind of 2 or 3 key points I'd like to make as part of these few minutes, a little bit of my own background. I started my career many years ago working on the Rwanda genocide and also in the former Yugoslavia and Sierra Leone. And thereafter worked with the International Committee of the Red Cross in a whole range of environments. And now recently as executive director of an organization that looks at private security contractors in high-risk environments. And what I think is somewhat, I think, frightening at some level, is that as much as we're talking about compliance issues, as you rightly pointed out in terms of as part of the introduction, throughout my entire career so far in this field, there have always been issues when it comes to enforceability of international humanitarian law, protection of civilians, and potential gaps that have been looked at in terms of what can be done. I think today, the point you asked about, the deficit issues, the compliance issues, I would term it as that compliance deficit. There clearly is in many armed conflicts around the world a pervading sense that the full respect of international humanitarian law, which is a state obligation, and non-state armed groups likewise have to follow that body of law, is simply not being met in terms of the obligations that have to be followed, but also the implementation that has to be followed through. The compliance deficit is there. And I think a lot of what we need to consider is how do you put the pressure points and where does the leverage exist to ensure that compliance can improve. I would argue that the level of political discourse is somewhat neutralized these days, given the fact that the UN Security Council is somewhat blocked on a whole range of issues, and that national interests seem to take, let's say, primacy over civilian protection and respect of humanitarian law in many contexts. So the political pressure, however, mustn't end. I think there's an essential need on the part of the international community, and in line with Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions, which is to ensure respect of IHL, that states ensure that they fulfill their obligation by ensuring that other states respect international humanitarian law. Yes. So yeah, the political component, which in my mind is essential going forward. But then ultimately, the decisions are made in the field. Ultimately, the questions have to be asked at the implementation level in terms of what is being done on the side of the warring parties to the armed conflict, on the side of the commanders and the operators. And here we have potentially three levels that we need to look at: strategic, operational, and tactical. When it comes to the military, and all of them have certain pressure points that can be met and can be addressed. And hopefully some of you will have some ideas in terms of where we can find those pressure points and how to have that discourse. But at the operational level, in a pure sense, we also need to consider what can be done to influence the key actors. And in my mind, the key actors in many of these high-risk environments and conflict situations are the military operators themselves, the commanders, the foot soldiers, and others. And so the work that many of you are doing, and international organizations and humanitarian actors and civil society organizations are carrying out in the field, have to maintain that pressure on the key stakeholders, which in my mind are the operators, the ones pulling the triggers, the ones making the decisions in terms of the military operations, the ones actually delivering in terms of what kind of operations and means and methods being used. And so the importance of looking at the entire chain of command and using the different pressure points for that chain of command, in my mind, is critical. There's also a need, I think, to have that dialogue, a continued dialogue with the actual soldiers, with those that are responsible for the final operations, for the final lethal action that will take place. And the pressure to be put on the soldiers where possible, to have them understand that there is a level of discretion in the manner in which they operate, and they are under an obligation to disobey manifestly illegal orders. And so I think that area needs to be unpacked a bit more in terms of what kind of education and training is still required for military operators to have them understand that there are simply some orders and some actions which under international humanitarian law are illegal, and they are duty bound to disobey those orders. And then secondly, in terms of the commanders, and this is commanders at all levels, not starting from the sort of brigadier generals and the generals, but at all levels, even at the level of the unit. Every commander has that responsibility to prevent and punish their subordinates in the commission if they're committing war crimes. And so questions have to be asked in that regard of the duty imposed upon commanders and how then we engage operationally, and it's good to see Civic here, but working closely with the military operators in the field, with the foot soldiers, with all commanders in that regard. That's the, I think, compliance piece when it comes to protection of civilians, and that's the compliance deficit, which is clear in my mind and prevails in many, many contexts. But turning to the second point in the few minutes that I have, the area I would like to sort of unpack a bit more is the question of humanitarian assistance. And I see the federations here as well, and I know we'll be talking about that later on. And the question of humanitarian access, because ultimately we can control the military dialogue, but fundamentally what we're trying to ensure is that civilians are effectively spared from the harm of the conduct of hostilities, but when hostilities are occurring or when there's an armed conflict, that there's unimpeded access to civilian populations and those in need, and that humanitarian access is provided by agencies or the state parties, the parties to the armed conflict who have the obligation. And if those state parties are not fulfilling those obligations, that independent humanitarian organizations can step in and carry out those activities, which Geneva Conventions rightly underscore as being of prime importance. But as we've seen in many contexts, humanitarian access is becoming a struggle, and the security not only of the civilians in need of humanitarian support, but also of the humanitarian actors themselves is being put into grave question. We're seeing many, many reports of NGO humanitarian actors, humanitarian workers being potentially directly targeted during military operations, and at a minimum being also indirectly affected by military operations. So a big question there in terms of how do we ensure the protection of humanitarian actors. And the last piece, I don't think we can leave this room without discussing the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. I think the discourse is quite controversial, it's quite heated, it's quite emotive. And I would like to maybe put out a couple of provocative statements or suggestions that maybe the humanitarian sector needs to look at in a bit more depth. My work is looking at the role of private security contractors and private military contractors in armed conflict situations. The 3 points that, or the 3 reference points today for discussions around those actors have been Blackwater, Iraq, the Wagner Group, Ukraine, Russia, Central African Republic, and now the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Unfortunately, that's the stop and start conversation in the humanitarian sector when it comes to the role of private security contractors in armed conflict situations. And this is something which I know a number of you have heard me say in the past, in my mind is a major deficit in the humanitarian and development sector in terms of a real understanding as to the roles, responsibilities, and use of private security contractors in armed conflict situations. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, as contentious as it is potentially a model of what could be going forward. There is going to be a reliance on the part of many governments and a reliance on the part also of humanitarian actors on private security contractors to carry out certain operations, including providing security for humanitarian assistance. And we're seeing that operationally. It's not new. It's not Blackwater. It's not Wagner Group. It's prevalent in every single armed conflict. Yet I would challenge the humanitarian sector, and I worked for the ICRC for 10 years, so I've been at that sort of cutting edge as well. I would challenge the humanitarian sector to look at what private actors have assumed as roles in armed conflict situations, to assess not only the negative impact of private security contractors, but also to assess their own responsibilities as humanitarian actors using private security contractors. The vast majority of NGOs and international organizations today use private contractors in armed conflict situations. But the vast majority of those actors do not have a discussion as to responsibilities, humanitarian principles, and accountability. So maybe laying that as a kind of a provocative or simply an encouraging statement to say there is a need for that debate as well when we speak about protection, enforcement, and access, because without that conversation about the role of private actors, we're going to go around in circles as well and not fix some of the key issues. I have no idea if that was 5 or 9 minutes, so I apologize, but I'll pause here and I'm open to any sort of questions or challenges that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you for your valuable contribution, and you successfully made it to 9 minutes, so no worries about that. And then we'll hear from Dr. Pellaton. Dr. Pellaton, please go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies, colleagues, thank you, ILEF, for the opportunity to contribute to this really vital discussion on enforcing international humanitarian law in the Middle East. This region, we all know, is marked by protracted conflicts and complex humanitarian emergencies, where the gap between law on paper and the reality on the ground is painfully wide. And despite robust legal framework, we continue to see widespread violations, limited accountability, and persistent obstacles to civilian protection and humanitarian access. At the Geneva Water Hub, a joint center of the University of Geneva and the Graduate Institute, we view these challenges through the lens of water. Our mission is to ensure that water is shared equitably and spared from the ravages of war, and we initiated the Global Alliance to spare water from armed conflict. Water systems are not only physical infrastructure, they are the veins and arteries of public health with security, livelihood, and dignity. And beyond the headlines, when pollution of rivers or groundwater, the shelling of a reservoir or a treatment plant leaves scars that last for decades. When water is contaminated with heavy metals or hydrocarbons, as was the case in Basra and Northeast Syria, full recovery can take generations. The health consequences are equally long-term. In Basra, years after the contamination, hospitals still report illness linked to unsafe drinking water. Repeated attacks on water and water-related infrastructures and shortage of repairs capacity gradually cripple entire systems, making restoration almost impossible and prohibitively expensive. The most devastating effects are cumulative. In Syria, only half of the water and sanitation systems still function, down from 90% before the conflict, with severe consequences on access to safe drinking water and health, particularly for the most vulnerable. IHL offers multiple layers of protection for water and water infrastructure. It specifically prohibits attacks on water facilities and the use of water as a weapon, emphasizing the need to protect resources essential to civilian survival. Under the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions, water systems being civilian objects cannot be attacked. Parties must take precautions to avoid incidental damages to such objects. Dual-use objects, such as water treatment facilities used as well by civilian or by armed forces, are legitimate military targets under IHL only if they meet its definition. Many states stress that any damage to their civilian function or loss of vital services count as incidental harm in proportionality assessments. And to respect distinction and proportionality, parties must take all feasible precautions to minimize harm to civilians and civilians' objects. And there's also some special protection related to water which applies, such as the prohibition on attacking, destroying, removing, or rendering useless objects indispensable to the civilian survival, including drinking water installation and irrigation works, the prohibition on attacking works containing dangerous forces, such as dams and dikes, and the protection of the natural environment, which from widespread, long-term, and severe damage. And in situation of occupation, the occupying power must ensure the necessities of life, maintain public health and hygiene, and if unable, allow relief schemes. It may not impose collective punishment or deprivation of essential services, such as water. IHL rules are not optional. They are binding obligations grounded in the principles of humanity and interpreted in good faith to protect life. And I encourage you to look at the Geneva list of principles, which is a compendium of all the legal tools pertaining to the protection of water published by the Geneva Water Hub. However, despite these IHL protections, weaponization of water and violations by states and non-state actors are increasing, causing profound human suffering. If we look in Syria, and both government and opposition forces cut water to 1.5 million people in Aleppo, and the bombing of the ILEF, sorry for the pronunciation, spring, affected about 5 million residents. In Iraq and Syria, ISIS systematically weaponized water, destroying infrastructure and using water deprivation to control population. In Yemen, the repeated bombing of water and sanitation systems contributed to a devastating cholera outbreak in 2016. And in Gaza, the destruction of water systems combined with supply cuts and restrictions on fuel and spare parts has led to the almost total collapse of water and sanitation services. Depriving a population from access to water amounts to collective punishment of the civilian population and can be considered a war crime. The systematic deprivation of water can amount to crimes against humanity. And we talk about genocide if the intent is to destroy a group by denying it water. The right to water, including the right to safe and clean drinking water and sanitation, is a fundamental human right which should never be violated. The law is clear, but the challenge of the implementation, as my colleague already highlighted, persists. Among the reasons for this weak implementation, there are varying levels of awareness, understanding, or application of relevant legal frameworks among states and non-state armed groups. Besides, as armed conflicts evolve, urbanize, and introduce new technologies, international law must adapt to ensure the protection of civilians' infrastructure and services. And some of the key obstacles include the legal ambiguities around the long-term effects of attacks on infrastructure or pollution of water. There is no centralized enforcement mechanism. Compliance depends on political will. And this is compounded by the complexities of urban warfare, asymmetric conflicts, and involvement of non-state actors. And that's where the concept of reverberating effects is crucial. As the longer a conflict lasts, the more foreseeable these knock-on effects become and make a stronger legal case for factoring them into targeting decisions. To close the gap between law and reality, we must first and foremost, as was already highlighted by my colleague, enhance political will through diplomacy and multilateral engagement. This has led the Geneva Water Hub to jointly with Switzerland and Slovenia to launch the Global Alliance to Spare Water from Armed Conflict. The alliance, composed of state and non-state actors, works to ensure greater compliance with international law, protecting freshwater and water-related installation in armed conflicts. It aims to better inform on the long-term humanitarian consequences of weaponizing water. And finally, it harnesses expertise from the development and humanitarian sector to increase pre-conflict preparedness and resilience of water infrastructure. The Alliance was mentioned in the 2025 Secretary General's report on the protection of civilians, acknowledging the recognition of its work. We also need to strengthen monitoring via fact-finding missions, open source intelligence, and independent verification, and leverage the accountability mechanism at the national level by criminalizing intentional pollution or destruction of water infrastructure in domestic law. And at the international level, we need to leverage the international fora, such as the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court, for compliance to IHL and to prosecute attacks on water systems. On different occasions, the ICG has reaffirmed the importance of IHL, mentioning that occupying powers must safeguard essential services. However, it stopped at the decision of the court. And finally, we need to integrate protection of water into military manual and have engaged on that discussions with armed forces. I would like to conclude by saying that protecting water in conflict is not simply a humanitarian imperative, it's a cornerstone of peace, stability, and recovery. And if we fail to protect water, we fail to protect civilians and life. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Pellaton, for this very significant insights and contribution. And thank you both for very insightful opening remarks. And this obviously deeply consequential issue, enforcing international humanitarian law, is not only a legal imperative, but a moral and operational one as well, as you both mentioned, including the implementation. I think that's a perfect idea. I will do it. Thank you.
I'm really excited to start. It's not meant to be a team building effort. All right, sorry about that. Wonderful. Civilians.
This is a civilian protection, right? So, okay. So as I mentioned earlier, at this point, we'd like to open the floor to receive any questions. So if there's any question, please raise your hand, or if you're anyone joining us online, please indicate in the chat. Okay, Mr. Benson, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the two panelists to open the discussion. I have a question to Jamie Williamson with respect to the Gaza Humanitarian Fund. With your experience engaging with private military actors, PMSCs, to what extent do you think there's a real space for an organization or an actor as a GHF to actually improve their behavior, changing behavior in order to mitigate the harm that by default we acknowledge that is going to happen? And a second question in link with that, you may have seen recently in the New Humanitarian that there's been a so-called secret meeting in between humanitarian actors and the GHF. But that has generated an important polemic. It's very much of a white and black discussion. I wanted to hear about your opinion on that particular meeting. Yeah, I'll keep it here. Thank you.
Sorry to let you know that your microphone was turned off. Sorry? Your microphone was turned off while you're speaking, so the camera couldn't spot you properly.
Sorry.
If you don't mind, could you do it once again?
Now it's working. Sorry, I got confused by the green color. So my two questions were, if to Jamie Williamson, if you think there's any space, any real space of potential change of behavior from the Gaza Humanitarian Fund, considering your experience engaging with these PMSCs, and two, if you have an opinion about the recent so-called secret meeting that some humanitarians have had with this actor, and the polemic ongoing with respect to whether if humanitarians should meet with them and therefore validate and normalize their existence, or humanitarians should absolutely not do that in order to simply and totally disagree and denounce the existence of such an actor that is simply by default eroding or destroying the principles of humanitarian action. Thank you. Clarification, we Chatham House ruled here, or we go in public? Maybe taking the, in terms of change of behavior, I think the way I would approach it is the focus on the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation in terms of the discourse linked to the private security contractors is not the main issue. I think the main issue is actually, as you rightly pointed out, the development of an entity to effectively so-called deliver the humanitarian assistance, and from all reports doing so pretty badly with horrendous consequences for the civilian population. The change of behavior in terms of the military components and the political components, I think other organizations are better placed than I am to speak to that. The improved behavior potentially in terms of the private security contractors, however, that are hired for this foundation, and I dare say I would see this model potentially being replicated in other locations as well in years from now in terms of expediency, costs, potential efficiencies. The arguments have been made by many in that regard. The improvement in terms of behavior on the part of the private security contractors, that is very much possible. That's about bringing those contractors to the table. And our organization was established coming out of the Iraq conflict to improve the kind of vetting, selection, training, monitoring of those private security contractors, of going in country and seeing how those contractors operate, and then working with governments to make sure that you had an enforceable sanctions mechanism against those contractors where they were falling short. Those security companies that have been hired to carry out those operations in the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation or Fund are not part of the usual network. If you work long enough in this field, you can do your kind of 6-degree separation or your LinkedIn approach, 1, 2, 3, in terms of connections, and that you will see that some of those companies, or at least 2 of them, are either recently constructed. There's not much visibility about how they recruit their individuals and their staff, and there's very little understanding in terms of their accountability. So all those can be worked on. You just need the governments behind that process to step up and to bring those contractors to the table. The broader model is much more contentious. And I, coming from the ICLC background, I do believe in independent, impartial, neutral humanitarian assistance, and I very much prefer it to be carried out by, the experts out there that have done this for decades. Going to the New Humanitarian article, which I read on the plane back from East Asia, Yeah, I mean, it goes back to maybe my last point in terms of where the humanitarian sector presently sits. And I've spoken to the Federation about this and the ICRC for a number of years, and Civic as well, because Civic, for all transparency, used to sit on the board of my organization too. And we've had a very good relationship in that regard. There seems to be a real, it's like a blank spot on the part, or a blind spot on the part of the humanitarian sector in terms of trying to engage on these things, to try to engage on the role of private security actors or private military contractors in high-risk environments. They're all painted with a negative brush. They're all seen as poor actors, and they're all seen as risks to humanitarian activities and humanitarian assistance and the protection of civilians. Yet if you roll back, and I'll get to your precise question in a second on the article, if you roll back a bit, in virtually every single armed conflict situation that we operate in, NGOs, humanitarian agencies, one or two exceptions, rely on private security contractors for security of their premises, their logistic hubs, as well as access to certain locations. The United Nations is very open about it. In South Sudan, they were bringing in tens of millions of dollars over years, hiring local private security contractors made up of former non-state armed groups. Yet every time we try to move ahead on that conversation with the humanitarian sector, it blocks. It becomes a procurement issue. It becomes a third-party service consideration. Yet the role of security contractors, the debate on that should not be seen as negative. It should not be seen as risky, quite the reverse. It's a required conversation to understand how do you improve standards in that security industry, which has been relied upon by the humanitarian sector, but which is an industry which is operating in that sector. On the new humanitarian article, and interesting enough, I know a number of those individuals who are listed on the email sent out by the YASC. The conversations have to be had because ultimately the aim is we want to ensure that civilians are protected. We want to make sure that humanitarian assistance is reaching those in need. Hiding behind the illegality of an organization not to have that dialogue is wrong in my mind because it does not benefit those in need. So I believe those humanitarian agencies, I'm not speaking about them specifically, but I believe the whole humanitarian sector should learn to have that comfort dialogue, as we do with any armed group or any part in armed conflict, to have open conversations, not simply say they're bad, stay away from them. Actually say they're bad, however, they are there, be pragmatic, be open, have the discourse, have the advocacy. And yeah, the article is embarrassing because it does give the impression that it's cloak and dagger stuff. But ultimately, we are trying to ensure that civilians are protected, and they're the ones potentially that could be at risk here. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the discussion, especially on touching upon the pragmatic approach, being open, engaging in the open discussion. Okay, if there's any other question? No question for the session? Oh, Mr. Seven.
Just a quick follow-up on the previous question. So you mentioned the JHF may be a model kind of moving forward. Do you mean it in the sense of displacing traditional international humanitarian actors? And to what extent do you think future governments will be tempted to use a similar model to assert, let's say, greater control over the battle space?
I think the question or the answer is very much open to speculation. But having been in this sector for quite a while, having seen the kind of the politicization of conflict and the interests that many parties play in terms of how they want to control humanitarian aid and how it's delivered, and seeing the potential strengthening of the private sector in that regard, I don't believe it's a model which will not be replicated. Double negative makes a positive, I hope, to the extent that the United Nations is currently under a huge amount of pressure from a liquidity perspective. The NGO sector and the humanitarian sector, as we know, is likewise under a huge amount of pressure from a liquidity and funding perspective. And access has been a major issue for years as well, in many contexts. I think you go back to 9/11 and that kind of period where things started changing dramatically. Peacekeeping operations are similarly under massive pressure and can no longer operate in many contexts. So with all the traditional kind of humanitarian actors under those kind of pressure points, but then the private sector stepping up as a potential model of efficiency, and a model of efficiency which is not going to basically call into any questions with regard to humanitarian principles. They'll be saying, there's a contract, we can fulfill it, we'll do it, we'll respect the law ideally, but we need to work with them on that one. Governments will be inclined to go towards that. It may not be an exact replication of that model, and it may not be a complete displacement, but I think the presence of the private security actors with no long-term funding issues and a contract-by-contract basis, in my mind, especially if those companies are staffed by former military and former law enforcement who are familiar fodder for governments, means that potentially that could go that way. So if we think the trend is such that we are going to see a replication of such a model, it is our responsibility to step up and have that conversation and say, what if, if this model does develop, do we want to go against it completely and say it's wrong, we need to reassert the traditional actor's role in humanitarian assistance? Or do we say, even if we reassert that, it's going to be very, very difficult to displace potentially that growth of the model? So how do we engage on that model? How do we put in place those safeguards and principles and legal obligations? And then we avoid the kind of secret meetings and we come out and speak to that directly. Thank you. And say, what if, if this model does develop, do we want to go against it completely and say it's wrong, we need to reassert the traditional actor's role in humanitarian assistance? Or do we say, even if we reassert that, it's going to be very, very difficult to displace potentially that growth of the model? So how do we engage on that model? How do we put in place those safeguards and principles and legal obligations? And then we avoid the kind of secret meetings and we come out and speak to that directly. Thank you.